Hi, Brent Hadley here with a pinch of salt. Long time ago, in a country somewhere in the Middle East, there was a kingdom that was being ruled by a particular family. And in those days, when the king grew up and he got older and older, he was expected to pass on the power and the throne to his son. And they would try and repeat this cycle as long as they possibly could. Sometimes another family would come into power. And when the power was changing hands, the incoming family would try and eradicate the outgoing family, so there was never any other challenges to the throne, right? In this case, before the eradicating actually began, the outgoing family members dispersed and ran away and tried to hide. One of the family members, who was an infant baby at the time being taken care of by a nanny, she was in such a hurry to get away that she tripped down some steps, dropped the baby, who broke both of his legs. And now he had to grow up in those days as a cripple, because there were no hospitals or doctors to really take him to, and they were trying to hide. So she kept him secret, she kept him safe, but he grew up a cripple. And he went through his days knowing who he was, but trying to hide his name and his true identity, lest he be found out and taken to prison, or worse, probably killed. So he grew up as a beggar in the streets, and he lived his life on the generosity of others, going from house to house, sleeping wherever he could, basically a poor beggar who was dependent on other people for life. Well, back in the palace, the king was asking his soldiers, were there any other people left from the previous family? Was there anyone else left alive? And they actually had found out about this man. And they said, yes, there's a beggar in a town not so far away, and he was a relative of that family. And so the king sent his soldiers to get him, and they ran out and they found him. And the crippled man knew his time was over, because they took him to the palace and put him in front of the king. And he was sure the king would either throw him in the dungeon or probably have him killed. While he was waiting for his sentence of execution, the king told one of his servants to go get one of his robes. And he went to the man, knelt beside him, put his arms around him, and when they brought him the robe, put his robe around him, kissed him, lifted him up, and said, from this day forward you will live with me in the palace, and you'll eat at my table. The king was David. The crippled man, his name was Mephibosheth, and he was a relative of Jonathan, who was the son of Saul. Saul being the king that David replaced, right? And this whole time, because Jonathan and David had been such good friends, David had made a promise to Jonathan to always take care of his relatives if any were left. And so the whole time, Mephibosheth was living as a cripple, as a beggar in the streets, in the dirt. The whole time he was actually a friend, even closer than a friend, a relative of the king, and could have been living in the palace and eating at the king's table. But fear kept him in the streets. Fear kept him as a beggar, living off of scraps instead of eating from the king's table. The parallel I'm trying to get is that how many of us live our lives in fear as beggars in a spiritual sense, when all of us have already been called to be children of God. So that brings us to our verse in ASL today, which is 1 John 3:1. And it says, see what great love the Father has lavished upon us, that we should be called the children of God. So, as I've explained before, a direct translation from English to ASL, or really from one language to another, is never directly across the board. So I'm going to get you as close to ASL as I can. So this is what it would look like. See how much love God, and I'm going to do a big has given, because in ASL when you do a sign bigger, it means more and more, greater and greater. So if I would just say give, that would be one thing, but if I go and give, it means way, way bigger, right? Has given us that we are named God's children. So here it is again. See how much love God and big has given all of us, that we are named or called God's children. We don't need to live like Mephibosheth did in the streets as a beggar. We belong in God's presence, eating at His table all the way through eternity, because we are His kids.